Hi, welcome back to part 2 of chapter 27 for fluid, electrolyte, acid, and base. So, other than fluid and electrolytes, we mentioned way from the beginning of the semester that pH must be regulated very tightly in the body between the values of 7.35 to 7.45. We talked about this way in the blood chapter when we talked about the respiratory system and also when we talked about the urinary system. It's just a common theme throughout the entire AMP2 semester that we have to regulate our pH within certain levels. Now, before we get into how we maintain pH homeostasis, we need to cover some of the chemistry basics of acid and base. First of all, pH means the power of hydrogen, which means pH value tells you how much hydrogen ions is in the solution. If pH value is low, then that means you have a lot of hydrogen ions in the solution. If pH value is high, then that means you don't have a lot of hydrogen ions, but you have its counter ion, which is called the conjugate base, hydroxide ion. Okay? Now, the definition of an acid right here, in case some of you don't know, this table kind of summarizes all the basic definition of acid-base stuff, okay? So for acid is any substance that is able to release hydrogen ions, okay? And it will decrease the pH of the solution when we're adding an acid. The definition of a base is any substance that has the capability of releasing hydroxide ions or any other ions that can accept hydrogen ions. So that's why usually they are negative charge. For example, in the case of hydrogen ions, or if you remember from our case of carbonic acid, was bicarbonate ions. So this is not a hydroxide ion, but this has the capability of accepting hydrogen ions. So that's why it's considered as a base, okay? And for base, it increases the solution's pH. So make sure you don't mix that up on the exam. Decreasing pH is acidic, increasing pH is basic. I see a lot of times students get confused. They know it, okay? They know what's acid, what's a base, what's acidic, what's basic. But somehow the pH value sometimes messes them up. So make sure you remember low pH value, acidic. High pH value, basic, okay? Now, the ECF pH, if it's ever gets less than 7.35, okay, we call that a case of acidosis. And if the ECF pH ever get higher than 7.45, then we call that a case of alkalosis. And acidosis, alkalosis is kind of easy to remember because it's named by whether you're too acidic or if you're too basic, which is alkaline. Okay, so alkalosis for too basic. Now, why hydrogen ions or pH affects the body? As we can imagine, hydrogen ions itself, let's say you have the case of acidosis, you have too much hydrogen ions in the body. Well, any changes in the amount or concentration of hydrogen ions can disrupt plasma membranes. Well, that's troublesome. Plasma membrane is for making sure that you keep the integrity of the cell. If plasma membrane falls apart, the whole cell falls apart, and we don't want that to happen. A lot of times protein structure, in addition to of course, enzyme structure depends on pH levels. Some enzymes like acidic environment, some enzymes like basic environment, depending what part of the body it serves. But most enzyme likes neutral environment. And if you're changing the body's pH, a lot of these proteins are going to denature. When they denature, they will not be able to perform their functions anymore. So out goes enzymatic activities. So that's why pH changes or hydrogen ions concentration is very critical part of whether your body is able to function correctly. If you have severe acidosis, you will not survive long, okay? We're talking about pH either below 6.8, okay, or pH above 7.7. So severe acidosis would have a pH below 6.8. And if it's not fixed immediately, then it can get deadly. Your central nervous system will deteriorate, okay, which will put you in a coma. Your cardiac contractions will become weak and irregular in the case, and which then will stop your heart from functioning right, heart failure. Your peripheral blood vessels will all undergo vasodilation, okay? And when they undergo vasodilation, as we already learned before, that will drop your blood pressure. When you have a drop in blood pressure, you can get into circulatory collapse, or what we call going into shock, okay? Because your body does not have enough pressure to drive blood around your body, and your body is in lack of oxygen. So that's what we call a circulatory collapse, okay? So thus, the acid and base, must be balanced and has to maintain very well by three different things, okay? It can be maintained by buffer system. The respiratory system also contributes in some way in maintaining the pH of the body, and your renal system also contribute in maintaining pH of the body. We kind of already mentioned a little bit of all of this, so some of this is just review, okay? So don't be intimidated. It's just re-emphasizing some of the stuff that we already went over in previous chapter. Now, there are three types of acids that's formed in the body. So the first type we'll talk about is called fixed acids. This type of acids don't leave solution. They're not, they can't escape into the air as gas. They remain in solution in your body. So they will remain in there until somehow we can get rid of it through the kidneys by excretion into urine. Okay, that's why part of kidneys' job was that if there was too low of a pH, acidosis, then it would secrete hydrogen ions out into the urine. Okay, so these fixed acids, some of the examples we have in the body are sulfuric acid and phosphoric acid. Both of these kind of acids are formed during catabolism of amino acids, phospholipids, and nucleic acids. We didn't really talk about this back in the metabolism chapter, but you don't have to know the mechanism as to how these acids are formed. As long as you know what are fixed acids and where do they come from, and that's good enough, okay? And as listed in this slide. Second type of acid is called metabolic acid. This type of acid, however, we did talk about immensely. Okay, so in the metabolism chapter, so these are acid participant or byproducts of your cellular metabolism. That's why it's called metabolic acid, because it has to do with your metabolism. So for example, pyruvic acid, that's formed from glycolysis. That's a type of acid. Lactic acid, that's formed due to fermentation. If your body doesn't have enough oxygen and you undergo anaerobic respiration, lactic acid is formed. Ketone bodies, we mentioned that it is formed through metabolism of lipids or amino acids for energy. And that's why in starvation mode, you end up making too much of these ketone bodies. And that's why ketone bodies will decrease your body's pH, and you end up with acidosis, as we have talked about in that chapter. But a lot of these metabolic acids, technically speaking, under normal conditions, can be metabolized quickly, either by, for example, pyruvic acid. It will be metabolized quickly via Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain in any cell in the formation of ATP within the mitochondria. Lactic acid actually can be, like I said in the metabolism chapter, they can be metabolized or neutralized by your liver. Your liver will actually turn lactic acid back into pyruvate, and when oxygen is available again, then pyruvate can be shunted into the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain to be further metabolized. All right. Third type of acid is volatile acids. Okay, volatile acids are those that can leave the body and enter the atmosphere via your lungs. Okay, so this is what this volatile means. Volatile means that it can become a gas. Okay, so these are acids that can become a gas and hence can leave the body just by us breathing out. Okay, so we talked a lot about this back in the respiratory system chapter. So when your carbon dioxide level increases, okay, this is what we talked about in that respiratory physiology lab. So that's why I said back then, this is not the last you're going to see this. When you have too much carbon dioxide in the body, what happens is all that CO2 and around can combine with water to form carbonic acid, and carbonic acid will readily dissociate into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions, which means that's why when you have too much CO2 accumulated in the body, that can give you in the case of acidosis. This equation itself explains why when we have too much CO2, it ends up being acid, okay, giving us acidosis. This explains why too much CO2 lowers our pH. Now, if carbon dioxide levels decreases, then what happens is the other way around can, of the equilibrium can go, where you have hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions forming carbonic acid, which then can dissociate into water and CO2 to replenish the amount of CO2 available. So these are the two things that can happen depending on whether the case you have more CO2 or less CO2 in the body. Okay, now remember that your blood, for example, has an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. Carbonic anhydrase is just an enzyme that catalyzes this reaction even faster. It can turn carbon dioxide and water into carbonic acid in a much faster rate when you have carbonic anhydrase around. But that doesn't mean this reaction doesn't happen spontaneously. As we have saw in our respiratory physiology lab, when you blew into that sodium hydroxide, it turned that pink solution into clear solution pretty quickly. So that's all you blowing CO2 into the liquid. So that tells you that carbonic acid is formed spontaneously because you didn't add an enzyme carbonic anhydrase into the solution. But in the body's case, we have an extra enzyme to make this process even faster because everything in our body has to happen and react quickly to situations that's too high or too low. We have to bring it back to homeostasis quickly. So that is why we have an extra enzyme to help and catalyze that process. Okay? All right. And we already know that hydrogen ions, carbonic acid dissociate into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. Okay. Now, strong acids and strong bases will always tend to dissociate completely in solution. For example, if you dunk some hydrochloric acid into a beaker of water, all of that hydrogen ions and chlorine ions will completely dissociate from your hydrochloric acid solution. Okay, so you won't find hydrogen chloride floating around in the solution. They will all be dissociating into their individual ions. That's why it's a one-way arrow kind of deal. But if we're talking about weak acid and weak bases, then they don't dissociate completely, and you get a bit of both of the acid itself and its ion component. Okay, at normal pH and equilibrium will exist between these two. So for example, in the case of carbonic acid, this is not a one-way arrow right here. Okay, it is an equilibrium arrow where things can go this way or this way depending on the pH of the solution. Okay, if you have carbonic acid can dissociate into bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions if the pH gets too high. Okay, If your pH gets too low, then bicarbonate ion can actually sequester some of the extra hydrogen ions and form carbonic acid. Okay, so this back and forth movement of this equilibrium is what serves as the buffer system. Okay, we already talked about what a buffer is. A buffer contains compounds that can stabilize the pH of the solution by either adding or removing hydrogen ions. A weak acid will always donate hydrogen ions, whereas a weak base will absorb hydrogen ions. So, for the case of a weak acid, you have HA here, and this A can be anything. It's not saying it's a acid, okay? It's just saying it's any weak acid out there. Just the same as carbonic acid, okay? And it has a hydrogen. A weak acid always have a hydrogen ready to be donated, and it will go into hydrogen ions and form a negative ion, and we call that a conjugate base. So a weak acid, after donation of a hydrogen ion, will always form a conjugate base. And this conjugate base also has the capability of binding with the hydrogen ions to form your weak acid back. So it can go this direction or this direction depending on the pH of the solution at any given moment. So when pH is low, okay, when pH is low, which means this is an acidic condition, hydrogen ions can be removed by forming more weak acid. So then we're talking about this arrow here, okay? If pH is low, your equilibrium shifts to the left. Conjugate base will sequester the amount of hydrogen ions available and form this weak acid. When pH is too high, which means it's too basic, then hydrogen ions is added by forming more weak base or your conjugate base. So if pH is too high, then equilibrium shifts to the right, where your weak acid will form your hydrogen ions and your conjugate base. To add hydrogen ions back into solution, bring the pH back down to neutral. Okay? All right. So there are actually 3 buffer systems in the body to ensure that our pH is maintained within limits of homeostasis. One of them is called the phosphate buffer system. Phosphate buffer system we haven't talked about yet, but the weak acid is this right here, which is called dihydrogen phosphate, okay? 2 hydrogen phosphate ions. So that's why it's called dihydrogen phosphate. And then, of course, you will have your conjugate base here, which is monohydrogen phosphate, okay, with just 1 hydrogen and the phosphate ion. So this is what's serving as our weak acid and conjugate base to act as a buffer for the ICF. Okay, so now if our body runs out of this conjugate base, technically speaking, we always have some sort of reserve in the body as sodium monohydrogen phosphate. Okay, same thing for carbonic acid. Okay, we always have a reserve of bicarbonate ions available in forms of sodium bicarbonate in the body. Unless we also, run out of that, then we have to ingest that through diet. Okay. So this particular buffer system is important for maintaining pH within the ICF and the urine. It's specifically for the ICF, okay? So make sure you remember phosphate buffer system is for the ICF and is made up of this chemistry right here. A second buffer system relies on proteins and can be subdivided into 2 types. One uses amino acid as a buffer, the other uses hemoglobin. Okay, so amino acid buffer, let's talk about that one first. And it seems like amino acid is pretty useful in our body because it can serve as backup plan for energy. It can make proteins for us, of course, and now we can even serve as a buffer system. Okay, it's almost like a miracle thing. A miracle drug. But no, just kidding. So amino acid, for example, forms what's called a Zwitter ions. Can exist as a Zwitter ion. At neutral pH, your amino acid can have a positive charge on one end and a negative charge on the other end. Okay, so positive charge resides on the amino end and the negative charge resides on the carboxyl end, and that's why it's called a Zwitter ion. You may hear that from chemistry. If you've taken organic chemistry before, for sure you've heard of Zwitter ion. But Zwitter ion means this particular molecule can exist as positive charge and negative charge at the same time. And because of that, it can become a buffer because it has a capacity to donate a hydrogen positive ion, or the negative charge side can act as your conjugate base to accept extra hydrogen ions depending on the pH of the solution. So if you have increase in pH, which means it is getting too basic for your body, then your amino acid can act as your weak acid to donate hydrogen ions. And it donates hydrogen ions from the amino group here. Okay, so hydrogen ions gets donated into the solution to neutralize the solution, and now you have this forming from the amino acid because now you have lost the hydrogen ions due to donation to the solution. If excuse me, if the pH decreases, which means that condition of the body gets too acidic, then your amino acid will act as a conjugate base. And there's couple spots on the amino acid that can act as the conjugate base. One of them being your carboxyl group, which can bind to a hydrogen, or sometimes a side chain within the amino acid can also act as a conjugate base and bind extra hydrogen ions. So you are removing hydrogen ions from the solution into the amino acid to neutralize the pH back. Okay, so this is how amino acid can go either way, okay, as a buffer, depending if the solution gets too acidic or too basic. If it's too basic, it's going to act as a weak acid. If it's too acidic, it's going to act as a conjugate base. Now, the other subtype of protein buffer system we have already talked about as the hemoglobin buffer system in the respiratory system chapter. Your red blood cells, we mentioned, contain the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, and hence this is why they can absorb carbon dioxide from the plasma and convert it into carbonic acid, and then carbonic acid will readily dissociate into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. And hence, if let's say your blood needs more bicarbonate ions due to the fact that pH is getting too low, you're in acidosis, then we can rely on, remember, chloride shift. Remember that red blood cell, and there's that in and out. Chloride ion goes in, bicarbonate ion goes out. So this chloride shift can replenish the amount of bicarbonate ions that's in the plasma, and it can immediately take effect of the pH in the ECF because it's releasing bicarbonate ions into the plasma itself. Okay, so that's how these two buffer systems can help to regulate pH. Lastly, the third buffer system is our infamous carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, which is the major buffer system for our ECF. Okay, remember the major buffer system for ICF was the phosphate buffer system. For ECF, it is the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, and we already know the equation for this, where carbon dioxide and water will combine to make carbonic acid, and carbonic acid will dissociate into hydrogen ions, and bicarbonate bicarbonate ions. And if we are ever in lack of bicarbonate ions or running out of it, we can always replenish it with our bicarbonate reserve as sodium bicarbonate. Sodium bicarbonate can dissociate into sodium ion and bicarbonate ion, which this can then replenish the amount of bicarbonate ions available in the body if we ever run out. Now, so if we have a decrease in pH, meaning acidosis in the body, hydrogen ions are being added either from your fixed acids or from metabolic acids. Okay, this adds hydrogen ions in the body, which then will combine with the available bicarbonate ions. You have increased amount of carbonic acid, which then can be turned into carbon dioxide and water. Now you have increased amount of CO2. Well, how do we get rid of that? Well, we can just get rid of that by breathing out. So your lungs will then, increase respiratory rate to help get rid of all that CO2 accumulating in the lungs due to this buffering system, okay? Now, there are limitations of this buffer system. The three types of limitation is that it cannot protect the ECF from changes in pH from increased or decreased CO2 levels, which means that's why here they didn't mention volatile acid, okay? We cannot use this buffer system or rely on our lungs to get rid of CO2 for us when our very problem of having acidosis or alkalosis is because our lungs wasn't functioning correctly. Okay, so that's why CO2 increase or decrease CO2 level that led to the pH change cannot be fixed by this system that we just mentioned, because CO2 is its own weak acid. Okay. Now, second thing is that it can function only when the respiratory system and control centers are working, because you are relying on the lungs' capability of expelling that CO2 from your body. So if, let's say, you were punctured in the lungs, pneumothorax, okay? If your lungs can't function correctly, you can't breathe out CO2 correctly. This whole system fails if your lungs doesn't function correctly. Or let's say a person is in some kind of brain injury that it can no longer control your diaphragm. If you can't control your diaphragm, you can't inhale and exhale correctly, and hence the same thing happens. CO2 cannot be get rid of through your lungs. Now, the last thing is the ability to buffer acid will be limited by availability of bicarbonate ions. So this is a rate limiting situation here, where if you ever run out of even your bicarbonate reserve, then this whole system will fail, because it's relying on a steady supply of bicarbonate ions in order to neutralize the extra hydrogen ions so we can go on into the rest of the process. Okay. All right. Now, all those buffer systems we discussed are just temporary fix to the problem. Ultimately, we still have to solve the problem of how to eliminate excess hydrogen ions. Now, this involves two different processes, one in the lungs and one in the kidneys. The respiratory compensation involves the change in respiratory rate to stabilize pH of the ECF. It can increase or decrease the rate of respiration and alters pH by changing the pressure or the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the body. So if you have too much CO2 in the body, the pH will decrease because of the addition of carbon dioxide, and drives carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system to the right in formation of too much acid. Okay. Chemoreceptors in the carotid and aortic bodies. Remember, we talked about those chemoreceptors, osmoreceptors, and those baroreceptors back a couple chapters back. So chemoreceptors are detecting changes in chemicals, including carbon dioxide, and they are sensitive to the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the blood. And when it senses that there's too much CO2, it will stimulate your lungs, okay, and increase respiratory rate. Okay, so increased PCO2 leads to acidosis, and acidosis then is going to tell your lungs to increase respiratory rate. Now, what about renal compensation? What does it do? Now, renal compensation will change the rate of hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ion secretion or reabsorption by the kidneys in response to changes in the plasma's pH. So, for example, if you have too much hydrogen ions around, which decreases your pH, the case of acidosis, then hydrogen ions can be getting rid of through a couple different ways. Hydrogen ions can be secreted directly through countertransport with sodium ions, as we have already learned in the urinary system chapter. It can co-transport with chloride ions as well. Carbonic acid buffer system can also help in this case, and the phosphate buffer system can also try to change that decrease in pH back to neutral, okay? Now, hydrogen ions can be secreted a couple different ways, as we have discussed again from the urinary system. They can be secreted as ammonium ion using glutaminase, which is an enzyme that will break down amino acid glutamine. Okay, so this will produce ammonia, which, if combined with hydrogen ions, produces ammonium ion. And ammonium ion can be secreted into the urine through your nephrons. Okay, now if you have increased pH, which means a case of alkalosis, then the rate of hydrogen secretion can just decline, and you just don't reabsorb any more of those bicarbonate ions, because now you have too high of pH. You don't need bicarbonate ions to sequester hydrogen ions anymore, so you need to stop the reabsorption of bicarbonate ions. Hydrogen ions and chloride ions, however, are reabsorbed through the kidneys to replenish your body with more hydrogen ions, which will then bring the pH back up to neutral. Okay, so here's pictorial version of what I was talking about in terms of renal compensation. These are the same figures from the urinary system, but in case you forget, this is the acidosis. In case of acidosis, what happens in your kidneys? If it's in case of alkalosis, what happens in your kidney? Here's that carbonic acid bicarbonate system that also exists within the kidneys. The phosphate buffer system also exists within the kidneys. So that's why it talks about phosphate buffer system was a major buffer system for ICF and the urine. So that's where that come into play. And then you have your ammonia buffer system that I just talked about with glutaminase and glutamate. Okay, right here, glutaminase and glutamine. All right, and then alkalosis is when you don't want to reabsorb bicarbonate ions. Bicarbonate ions is being secreted back into the urine, and you have reabsorption of hydrogen ions and chloride ions because the bicarbonate ions excretion has to counter-transport with chloride ions, okay? All right, so this is another pictorial diagram that illustrates how respiratory and renal compensation work together at the same time in response to acidosis or alkalosis. So in the case of acidosis, when you have too much hydrogen ions around, here's too much hydrogen ions, it can be getting rid of through two ways. Through your respiratory system, your extra hydrogen ions will combine with bicarbonate ions, forming carbonic acid, which will form more carbon dioxide in the body, which can be expelled from your lungs. So your lungs will then increase respiratory rate to get rid of all that CO2, increases your pH back to normal. How about your kidneys? Your kidney can secrete the extra hydrogen ions through urine. It can also remove CO2, okay, by forming bicarbonate ions, okay, and also it can reabsorb any extra bicarbonate ions back into the body, so you can always replenish your CO2, your bicarbonate ions back into your bicarbonate buffer system. So that's the three things that your kidney does, okay? Secrete hydrogen ions, remove CO2, and reabsorb bicarbonate. And we already know how it removes CO2 by that same buffer system that exists within the kidney itself. All right. Now, in the case of alkalosis, which means your pH is too high, that means you need to replenish hydrogen ions. Where are we going to get hydrogen ions from? Also involved from respiratory and renal compensation. Well, your lungs has all this, we need to save our reserve of CO2 now, because CO2 and water can form more carbonic acid, which will then be able to form more hydrogen ions. So your lungs will decrease respiratory rate, which then increase the amount of CO2 that's in the body to form carbonic acid, to form more hydrogen ions, to replenish the system and decrease the pH back to normal. In the case of your kidneys now will secrete bicarbonate ions instead of hydrogen ions. It will generate hydrogen ions through those mechanisms we were just talking about and feed that back into the system. Okay? All right. So that's how the kidney will respond. Conserve hydrogen ions and secrete bicarbonate ions. Now, how about the acid-base disorder? Where do those come from? When, in what situation will we get respiratory or metabolic acid-base disorder? So let's talk about respiratory acid-base disorder first. Where do we get respiratory acidosis? When do we get that problem? This is when your respiratory system cannot eliminate all the CO2 that's generated by your peripheral tissue, and you get into a situation called hypercapnia, as we have talked about. Hypercapnia means your blood's amount of carbon dioxide has increased, which then lowers your body's pH. So that's why it's called respiratory acidosis, and this can be caused by hypoventilation, as we have talked about. Okay, hypoventilation, which means an abnormally low respiratory rate. All that CO2 is going to be accumulate in the body, in the lungs, and hence lowers your pH. Now, acute respiratory acidosis can be caused by cardiac arrest or drowning victims. Okay, if you're drowning, you can't breathe. CO2 is going to accumulate in the drowning person's lungs, in a sense, causing acute respiratory acidosis. Chronic respiratory acidosis can also result, okay, meaning long-term inability to expel CO2. This can be caused by things we have already mentioned as well. Emphysema, for example, congestive heart failure, pneumonia, pneumothorax, respiratory muscle paralysis, because it affects your diaphragm. If your diaphragm is not functioning correctly, you will not be able to breathe correctly enough or as efficient, and hence accumulation of CO2 within the lungs long-term, slowly in a progressive manner. Okay, so either way, acute or chronic can result in respiratory acidosis. How about alkalosis? Now, for both case of metabolic and respiratory alkalosis, they both tend to be more uncommon. It's always acidosis that's more common. But if it happens, respiratory alkalosis is when your respiratory activity lowers the amount of CO2 available. Okay, and we get into a situation of hypocapnia, too low of CO2, and increases your body's pH. This is usually caused by hyperventilation, and that's why it's uncommon. Most people don't undergo hyperventilation unless they have anxiety problems or some kind of breathing situation where they go into hyperventilation, which means an abnormally high respiratory rate. You're doing because you're breathing so fast, okay, your CO2 accumulation does not happen, and you have too low of CO2, which is why you end up with alkalosis. Hyperventilation, like I said, can come from people with extreme anxiety, psychological stresses, or even physical stresses such as pain. Sometimes people that undergo extreme pain, for example, from accidents or a really bad stab in the body, can also hyperventilate. Very simple treatment for people with stress and anxiety problems when they have that hyperventilation attack is just by breathing into a paper bag, as we have learned from our physiology lab, respiratory physiology lab, that breathing into a bag, you're breathing back your own CO2, okay, which calms your body down. So when a person's hyperventilating, that's why you give them a paper bag, so they can breathe into the paper bag, replenish the CO2 back in the body, so that you would stop, you would not have a problem of respiratory alkalosis. Other possible causes to respiratory alkalosis can be trying to adapt to high altitudes, because when you go into high altitudes, you're in lack of oxygen. There's not enough oxygen available, and that can also affect your carbon dioxide levels. Patients on mechanical respirators, that can happen. Kind of like what we're talking about in terms of ventilators now with COVID-19. They can also have respiratory alkalosis. Brainstem injuries resulting in no response to changing CO2 levels. And hence, that's what I was saying, that if your brain doesn't respond, have no, let's say the chemoreceptors are broken and they can't function as they should, they don't know the change in CO2, that can also lead to respiratory alkalosis. And this is the chart that talks about the case of respiratory acidosis, what happens in your body, and what happens when you have respiratory alkalosis. Let's say respiratory acidosis caused by hypoventilation. What happens is that you will increase in amount of CO2 in your body, which results in a drop of pH. Chemoreceptors are stimulated within your blood and your cerebrospinal fluid, tells your lungs to increase respiratory rate, tells your kidney to secrete hydrogen ions, generate more bicarbonate ions. All those buffer systems kick into effect, other than the bicarbonic acid, because now we're talking about something due to CO2 being the major problem. Okay, it being the major problem cannot contribute as a buffer system. Okay, so all that stuff here will then decrease your PCO2 back to normal and decrease your hydrogen ions, which brings your pH back to normal. And of course, the other way goes around for the case when you have hyperventilation to high of pH, and what your body does here to bring your pH back to normal. All right, metabolic acid-base disorder. So just as respiratory, we have metabolic problems too. When do we get metabolic acidosis? Okay, this defines as production as large number of fixed acids or metabolic acid. Remember, we talked about that. When do we get metabolic acid accumulation? Starvation, okay? Overload of carbonic acid or bicarbonate ion buffer system can also result in metabolic acidosis. Like I said, your buffer system is just temporary fix to the problem. If you overload it long term, okay, it will, exhaust its ability to buffer. So lactic acidosis, for example, remember we talked about that, is what happens after strenuous exercise or prolonged hypoxia. Okay, remember prolonged hypoxia means long-term periods of not having enough oxygen, and your body shunts into prolonged periods of anaerobic metabolism, which means that's doing fermentation, and fermentation's byproduct is lactic acid. If you have too much lactic acid and you don't listen to your body and you just keep going and going and going, that can lead to lactic acid acidosis. Ketoacidosis is when you have generation of large amount of ketone body, and as I said, when you have starvation, okay, not just starving yourself for a meal or two, I'm talking about chronic starvation, or poorly controlled diabetes mellitus will also lead to ketoacidosis. Remember, diabetes mellitus has to do with blood glucose metabolism. When you have diabetes mellitus, your body cannot use glucose as a source of energy because you don't have insulin, or your insulin receptors are not working properly. So then your body then turns to fat or amino acid as a last reserve for energy instead. So that's why poorly controlled diabetes mellitus can also end up with ketoacidosis. Now, the other causes can be by, something called glomerulonephritis. Glomerulonephritis has to do with the inability of your kidney to secrete hydrogen ions. Something's going wrong where your glomerulus or your nephrons are not working properly. You're not secreting enough hydrogen ions, so that can lead to buildup of acids in the body, or severe bicarbonate ion loss due to chronic diarrhea. This is what we're talking about. That other than electrolytes, you are losing bicarbonate ions as well when you are having bouts and rounds of diarrhea. So because you're losing so much bicarbonate ions, you end up accumulating too much hydrogen ions, and that can lead to metabolic acidosis. Now, with metabolic alkalosis, again, this is a rare situation compared to metabolic acidosis. This is when bicarbonate ions is elevated. Some potential cause of bicarbonate ion accumulation is that, for example, if you have rounds and rounds of vomiting, let's say you have food poisoning, okay, and you end up vomiting constantly throughout the day. So repeated vomiting, your stomach is constantly generating stomach acid, to replenish for what's lost from your stomach, okay? So then you end up with extra bicarbonate ions when you're just always generating that hydrogen ions, okay? Hydrogen ions, bicarbonate ions always go hand in hand in exchange. If you're expelling a lot of hydrogen ions, you're going to reabsorb bicarbonate ion. If you are expelling a lot of bicarbonate ions, then you're going to reabsorb a lot of hydrogen ions. So that's how you end up with metabolic acidosis or metabolic alkalosis. Now, this table is a good table here that summarizes what is the difference between these four conditions: respiratory or metabolic acidosis and respiratory or metabolic alkalosis. Okay, make sure you review this if you're not understanding the differences between these type of disorders. Now, this chart here, homeostasis chart here, is representing two different cases of metabolic acidosis. One, metabolic acidosis can come from increase of hydrogen ion production or decrease hydrogen ions excretion. The other case is caused by too much bicarbonate ion loss, or your bicarbonate ion reserve is depleted. Okay, so these both situation here represents acidosis in two different ways. And of course, your body will react differently in these two situations. So make sure you go back to this. I'm not going to repeat myself because it's basically what I've been talking about over and over again. What happens to your lungs? What happens to your kidneys? What does your buffer system do to replenish all that hydrogen ions or bicarbonate ions? Okay. All right. Now, in the case of metabolic alkalosis, is usually due to loss of hydrogen ions or too much gain of bicarbonate ions. So then this is what your body will do. Or this is what your body will do to replenish or bring things back to homeostasis, to bring your blood pH back down to normal, because this is alkalosis, which means pH is too high. So you need to bring it back down to neutral pH, okay? Make sure you write that down, because every time I think even myself can get confused. So this is acidosis, pH is too low, so you got to bring pH back up when you're doing homeostasis, okay? All right, and the last chart here is not going to be on the exam. It's just something that's very interesting for you to follow through. I won't ask any question on the exam. It gives you an idea, though, why acid-base imbalance can be a good indication of the whole bunch of different diseases that can happen depending on your body's condition of carbon dioxide and bicarbonate ions. So, for example, a patient comes in, you check their pH, okay? If it's too low or too high, then you go to either acidosis or alkalosis situation. Then you check their, CO2 levels, their pressure of CO2 inside their body. If PCO2 is normal or decreased, then it has to be something to do with metabolic acidosis. If PCO2 was increased more than 50 millicurie, then it must be something to do with respiratory acidosis. Then you move on to, sort of process of elimination depending on the situation in that particular patient. And then you can narrow down to what is the ultimate cause, or what can be a possible cause to their situation of acidosis or alkalosis. Is it respiratory reason, or is it metabolic reason? If it's metabolic reason, what is it? Is it lactic acidosis, ketoacidosis, or is it diarrhea? Then you would know what is the right thing to do in terms of diagnosis and what to give the patient to alleviate their symptoms. Of course, the doctor is the ultimate person that will, decide what to give the patient. But you, as a nurse, as a PA, whatever it is, it's good to know this diagnosis process in the case related to acid-base disorder. Okay? All right, so this concludes chapter 27, which was not too tough of a chapter because multiple concepts is just reiteration of concepts from previous chapter. Now it was just applying them to the body's fluid, electrolyte, pH status, and understanding how our body will respond to regulate those factors. So it's a very interesting chapter, but you just have to sit down, take it down slowly, and digest the material, okay? The next two chapter, I promise you, is an easy chapter. It's kind of like your back to your digestive system chapter where there's a lot of parts, because reproductive system, there's nothing much to regulate. It's just hormones and what are the parts that can generate gametes and generation of, and the process of gametogenesis, spermatogenesis, and oogenesis. What is the process involved? Okay, so and then the last chapter goes over embryo development, which is pretty straightforward as well. So the hard, tough application chapter is this fluid electrolyte acid base chapter. So make sure you really thoroughly digest it before the final exam. Okay, all right.